Good morning, Little Masters, and welcome back to today's Tolkien Times, a Prancing Pony podcast production. I'm the Man of the West, and it's time to wrap up week 71 with Silmarillion Saturday. Now, these Saturdays are our chance to revisit the history and legends of the Elder Days, whether from the Silmarillion, Unfinished Tales, or more. Now, last week, we began Of the Rings of Power in the Third Age, where Sauron just couldn't bring himself to do the right thing. We also saw the elves establishing new havens, thanks to the dramatic changes in Middle-earth's coastline, as well as the creation of a Noldoran realm known as Eregion. Today, we bear witness to the creation of the Rings of Power. Elsewhere in Middle-earth there was peace for many years, yet the lands were for the most part savage and desolate, save only where the people of Beleriand came. Many elves dwelt there indeed, as they had dwelt through the countless years, wandering free in the wide lands far from the sea. But they were Avari, to whom the deeds of Beleriand were but a rumor, and Valinor only a distant name. And in the south and in the further east men multiplied, and most of them turned to evil, for Sauron was at work. Seeing the desolation of the world, Sauron said in his heart that the Valar, having overthrown Morgoth, had again forgotten Middle-earth, and his pride grew apace. He looked with hatred on the Eldar, and he feared the men of Númenor, who came back at whiles in their ships to the shores of Middle-earth. But for long he dissembled his mind, and concealed the dark designs that he shaped in his heart. Men he found the easiest to sway of all the peoples of the earth, but long he sought to persuade the elves to his service, for he knew that the firstborn had the greater power, and he went far and wide among them, and his hue was still that of one both fair and wise. Only to Lindon he did not come, for Gil-galad and Elrond doubted him and his fair seeming, and though they knew not who in truth he was, they would not admit him to that land. But elsewhere the elves received him gladly, and few among them hearkened to the messengers from Lindon bidding them beware, for Sauron took to himself the name of Anatar, the Lord of Gifts, and they had at first much profit from his friendship. And he said to them, Alas for the weakness of the great! For a mighty king is Gil-galad, and wise in all lore is Master Elrond, and yet they will not aid me in my labors. Can it be that they do not desire to see other lands become as blissful as their own? But wherefore should Middle-earth remain forever desolate and dark, whereas the elves could make it as fair as Eressëa, nay, even as Valinor? And since you have not returned thither as you might, I perceive that you love this Middle-earth, as do I. Is it not then our task to labor together for its enrichment, and for the raising of all the elven kindreds that wander here untaught, to the height of that power and knowledge which those have who are beyond the sea? It was in Eregion that the counsels of Sauron were most gladly received, for in that land the Noldor desired ever to increase the skill and subtlety of their works. Moreover, they were not at peace in their hearts, since they had refused to return into the west, and they desired both to stay in Middle-earth, which indeed they loved, and yet to enjoy the bliss of those that had departed. Therefore they hearkened to Sauron, and they learned of him many things, for his knowledge was great. In those days the smiths of Ost-in-Edhil surpassed all that they had contrived before, and they took thought, and they made rings of power. But Sauron guided their labors, and he was aware of all that they did, for his desire was to set a bond upon the elves, and to bring them under his vigilance. Now the elves made many rings, but secretly Sauron made one ring to rule all the others, and their power was bound up with it, to be subject wholly to it, and to last only so long as it too should last. And much of the strength and will of Sauron passed into that one ring, for the power of the elven ring was very great, and that which should govern them must be a thing of surpassing potency. And Sauron forged it in the mountain of fire in the land of shadow. And while he wore the one ring, he could perceive all the things that were done by means of the lesser rings, and he could see and govern the very thoughts of those that wore them. But the elves were not so lightly to be caught, As soon as Sauron set the one ring upon his finger, they were aware of him, and they knew him, and perceived that he would be master of them and of all that they wrought. Then in anger and fear they took off their rings. But he, finding that he was betrayed and that the elves were not deceived, was filled with wrath. And he came against them with open war, demanding that all the rings should be delivered to him, since the elven smiths could not have attained to their making without his lore and counsel. But the elves fled from him, and 3 of their rings they saved, and bore them away, and hid them. Now these were the 3 that had last been made, and they possessed the greatest powers. Narya, Nenya, and Vilya they were named, the rings of fire, and of water, and of air, set with ruby, and adamant, and sapphire. And of all the elven rings, Sauron most desired to possess them, for those who had them in their keeping could ward off the decays of time and postpone the weariness of the world. But Sauron could not discover them, for they were given into the hands of the wise, who concealed them and never again used them openly while Sauron kept the ruling ring. Therefore, the 3 remained unsullied, for they were forged by Celebrimbor alone, and the hand of Sauron had never touched them. Yet they also were subject to the One. Wow, so very much here as we get all the details of the making of the Rings of Power. Now Sauron decides it is time to fill the void left by the overthrow of Morgoth and the abandonment of Middle-earth, or at least so it seems, by the Valar. He hates the elves, he fears the Númenóreans. It's interesting because hatred and fear really seem to be the driving force for both Morgoth and Sauron. But Sauron's a bit more patient, I think, than Morgoth was. He hides that fear and hate and begins to work his influence. Now, sure, he can sway men, they're easy, but he knows that the elves are the ones with the power, and so he goes on this charm offensive. Remember, he's a Maya. He can take whatever raiment he chooses. Now, that's a power that he will eventually lose after the drowning of Númenor, but he can do it for now. Now, he couldn't get into Lindon thanks to Gil-galad and Elrond, but he's received by the elves everywhere else, despite messages from Lindon pointing out the red flags. And then look at the way he pulls the strings, suggesting that Gil-galad and Elrond have selfish, self-serving reasons for speaking badly of him, all while setting up his gullible marks for the work he's about to do. Can it be that they do not desire to see other lands become as blissful as their own? I mean, we all love this place. Isn't it our responsibility to raise up all the elves to the same height as those in Aman? Once again, just like he'll do later with Ar-Pharazôn, he's prompting an unnecessary jealousy of elves in the Undying Lands. And it's even worse here because these are elves, and yet he's still getting them to be jealous. It's mind-boggling, really. Now, of course, it's the crafty Noldor who listen most to him, and not only listen to him, but essentially work for him as they craft the Rings of Power. They do that while secretly Sauron makes the ruling ring, tying up the power of the others in his own, and, in the one thing that will eventually be his downfall, passed much of his strength and will into that one ring, setting it up to be his doom as well as his power. Now, we learned that the 16 rings, those are going to be the ones that we see as 7 for the dwarves and 9 for men, were made first, and then the 3, while Sauron was crafting the 1. And it would appear that the 3 were made perhaps when Sauron was off in Mordor making the 1, because we read that they were forged by Celebrimbor alone, and the hand of Sauron had never touched them. Not that it matters a whole lot. I mean, their power is still subject to the 1, but at least we get a chance here to learn about the 3, their names, their stones, and their powers. Narya, the ring of fire set with ruby, Nenya, the ring of water set with adamant, and Vilya, the ring of air set with sapphire. Now, I'm sure we will talk more about those 3 elven rings another time, but for now, folks, that does it for this week's Silmarillion Saturday and for week 71. Thank you for joining me, and please come back next week as we continue Of the Rings of Power in the Third Age, or Otrapata, with special gifts for dwarves and men from your new lord and master, the benevolent gift-giving Sauron. Please visit patreon.com/TolkienTimes to learn how you can get an ad-free feed, bonus episodes, be a part of my content council to help me decide what I'll talk about next series. Now, podcast listeners, not a thing is changing for you, but I still hope you'll check out the YouTube channel, even if it's just for the PPP plays. Folks, you might have noticed, those of you that are watching, that the handle for this channel has been changed to @PrancingPonyPod. That's because we're combining all of the content on all 4 of the shows into one YouTube channel. That includes the back catalogs of the Prancing Pony Podcast and Rings of Power Wrap-Up, along with my new streaming show, The PPP Plays, which launched earlier this week and runs Tuesdays and Fridays at 6 p.m. Pacific. Now, those days and times will eventually change, though, so be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. And since I am producing 4 different shows, it's time to consolidate all social media, too. So be sure you're following @PrancingPonyPod on Twitter, Blue Sky, Instagram, TikTok, and really any place else. Those other handles will eventually be retired. Now, finally, as Faramir says, go with the goodwill of all good men.